great privilege to have with us on stage Professor Adam Tooze for a conversation with Dr. Pratap Bhanu Mehta. Dr. Pratap Bhanu Mehta is the Laurence S. Rockefeller Professor for Distinguished Teaching at Princeton University and an Honorary Senior Fellow at CPR. He was previously the Vice-Chancellor of Ashoka University. Professor Adam Tooze holds the Catherine and Shelby Cullom Davis Chair of History at Columbia University and serves as the Director of the European Institute. In 2019, Foreign Policy magazine named him one of the top global thinkers of the decade. Over to you.
Good afternoon. I know this is a post-lunch session, but with Adam here, I'm sure we are in for a riveting time. So, Adam, listening to you last night in this absolutely fantastic talk, it's Hegel, Marx, Adam Smith, all rolled into one, and you're also much more fun to talk with than they might have been. I'm very tempted to use this session to kind of talk more generally about the modern condition using some of your own work and kind of the long arc of your writings and the way they speak to this present moment. And I want to begin with the point at which you began your talk yesterday, that quote from Alan Greenspan about, in a sense, markets disciplining states, and almost as if we have to subject ourselves to this necessity called the markets. Now, if one looks at the modern world, right, and since you've written about this a lot, particularly in the context of the early 20th century, if you place yourself in the late 18th century, let's say around the time of the French Revolution, there's one very astonishing modern project that comes out of that revolutionary tradition, not just the French, but various, which is this incredible hope that our social arrangements, our political arrangements, are things we can remake and remake according to our own will. They can be subject to the requirements of reason and justice. They are artificial, they are artifices, so we can make and unmake them. Society is this kind of plastic thing, and the job of politics, in a sense, is to create a much more just and reasonable society. And the binding constraint on that, the other kind of side of the story, was nature, which is nature is where we are constrained, right? We used to think of necessity as being aligned with nature. Nature places limits on us. But when we look at contemporary politics in the arc of, political debates over the last 200 years, the paradox that jumps out is how we, in a sense, reversed that idea. We naturalized society so that certain kinds of institutions, capitalism, the nation-state form, seem to be these necessary constraining horizons. And in a way, that's what Alan Greenspan is kind of referring to, in a way, right? And yet nature, we said we will radically remake it. We will alter the nitrogen cycle, the carbon cycle, our genes. Have it. I just want to invite you to first kind of reflect on this paradox and what this says about our possibilities of a particular kind of radical politics at this point, where we think of politics as operating within the horizons of necessity, but nature, in some senses, providing this open field for mastery. And then maybe we can kind of use that to jump into some discussion around climate change, which I'll come to.
It's such a privilege to be in conversation with Pratap, and you can see why. It's not often you get asked a question quite like that. It's fascinating that the hook, I think, that between last night's conversation and the question you've just posed is John Maynard Keynes's phrase, which I belabored last night, anything we can actually do, we can afford. And that has that kind of dialectic of possibility and constraint, right? And I was sort of playing with that because the openness, the voluntarism is we can afford. The hidden constraint is actually do, can actually do. And I feel are kind of poised between those two moments. And it is a moment, I think, for long-range reflection on this, because I do think, if I'd wanted to set things up at an even higher level of generality, you could have said that the current moment is not, as it were, one in a sequence that starts in the 1870s. That was a little kind of simple thinking, really, sort of economic orders that are disrupted, and so 1890, 1914, 1945, 50, and so on. You could say that we are back, let me just say this and then back away from it, like we're back in a Malthusian moment, or we're back in the frame of problems that open up precisely in that space. So the French Revolution on the one hand, and the answer by Malthus. And Malthus is, of course, famous the world over for this very simple idea that population will outrun territory, and at that point you'll have famines kicking in and population will self-regulate. What's less well known is that Malthus's entire project was a critique of radical politics, because why was it that human demography would become unfettered? Because he was arguing, in fact, with advocates of free love in the radical wing of British politics, English politics in the 1790s. And so the idea was that the French revolutionary notion of emancipation would unleash unfettered population expansion, and that's really why the natural constraints had to be brought in. So this dialectic between natural constraint, whether it's directly natural or mediated by markets, and the promise of radical politics, I completely agree, goes back, it's a 250-year epochal kind of frame. And there are ways of, Malthus himself, of course, conceded, you have to put yourself, he's an Anglican cleric, so of course there are various ways of avoiding the demographic catastrophe, including contraception, but those add then the theological constraint, which is that if you engage in contraception, you're going to hell. So it's not really a solution to your problem. That's vice, and vice leads to no good things. We, of course, also discovered free trade, which expanded the limits of the capacity, and then we added technology and remade nature that way. But I do think that one way of thinking of the sort of shuddering sense of running up against buffers that we're experiencing is that Malthusian constraint in the most naked natural form, not in the form of naturalized markets, is kicking in. Having said that, and I paused over this, because, I kind of quipped in the talk. I said, Alan Greenspan said, oh, wasn't he silly? Markets rule the world. And then I wanted to say, no, the world rules the world. In a sense, it's actually the natural logic that just governs. But that's not adequate, right? That's not adequate to our situation, because if you think about what actually happened in COVID, and particularly if you compare it to the Spanish flu, and you stay focused on India, right? The astonishing thing about COVID in 2020 is that India, along with every other relatively and absolutely low-income country in the world, decided it needed to react to this public health threat. If necessary, by clumsy, contentious lockdowns, but it had to react. There was an absolute understanding that something had to be done, right? And you can then argue till the cows come home about techniques, but that fundamental responsibility of the state towards human life was non-negotiable, really, beyond a certain... Well, at least in that moment. It becomes fully negotiable later, but there's a moment in which it's non-negotiable. And if you compare that with the Spanish flu epidemic under the British Empire at the beginning of the 20th century, we all know the story. The uncounted tens of millions of fatalities of the Spanish flu epidemic are within the zone of the British Empire and uncounted because the British Empire in no way honoured that kind of sense of responsibility to its subjects. They were not registered, they were not counted. We don't know how many of them died, but we can estimate from the censuses that there must have been absolutely catastrophic excess mortality. So what that implies is that it isn't just the natural constraint that's binding us now. It's the natural constraint combined with certain, at this point, irresistible political ideas about entitlement. Irresistible, I say that, but then we all know irresistible and eminently resistible, but when they become salient, right, the argument of saving life and that as an absolute priority becomes really hard to resist. And so that, for me, is the caveat. Yes, we're in a Malthusian moment, but a Malthusian moment supercharged by the accumulation. We couldn't call it excrescence. We should call it, we should credit ourselves, the accumulation of rights claims and expectations about governance, which mean that all of our shocks in this new Malthusian era are going to be reflexive second-order or third-order crises. They're always going to be not the death itself, but the fact that the death overwhelms the public health system, which we expect to also deal with cancer patients and car accidents. And then it will spiral into a financial crisis, which will then have to be absorbed by a central bank acting in a bond market, at which point you're at the third order level of crisis. And then you could have a fourth order legitimation debate, which would be about the management of the entire thing. And that could bring a regime down, as it almost did in Belarus, right? But it isn't the death as such, which remains in and of itself. You know, we all die alone, we all die our own way. It requires meaning to be added. And as we know from the politics of disaster all over the world, right, it's never just the disaster per se. It's always also the willingness to actually accept it as a fact and as a force that we have to deal with.
So let me kind of build up on that point and maybe put a question very simplistically, relating both to climate change and pandemics. I mean, two things you've written about. So, you know, my friends in the tech world, right, I mean, there's this ideology, Techno-solutionism, right? They might hear a conversation like this and go something like, what are you social scientists and historians talking about? We are in an age where the possibility of energy costs, bringing down energy costs substantially close to zero. Information costs have come down considerably. You have the technology to bring down at least food and nutrition costs. It might not be agriculture, but it could be food and nutrition costs substantially, and bring down transport costs substantially. And it seems to me that we are still, I think, quite enchanted by the possibility that there's a kind of techno-solutionism, and that route might be easier to achieve than thinking about these complex nested institutions. Even with the pandemic, I think what's interesting is that, you know, rather than thinking about the ecological balance, zoonotic transmission, those social arrangements that make this kind of pandemic possible, the response was a kind of Techno-solutionism. We get a vaccine right, we get a medicine right, in a sense, end of story. And to what extent is this Techno-solutionism both a possibility, but also a big hindrance in thinking about what the predicament of climate change and pandemic actually looks like? Because I suspect that actually a lot more people are actually enchanted by that Techno-solutionism story, which is that remaking nature story.
So enchantment is fun, but it's also bad to us enlightened people, right? I mean, clearly, if we could actually be enchanted and it really worked, I mean, who wouldn't want that? That would clearly be better. But so we resist enchantment because we have this suspicion that it's probably false. But I think we can also take that resistance too far. I mean, and to me, Keynes is the master thinker of our moment because he is a Burkean, right? And I mean, and that also connects him to your French Revolutionary moment from his youth. He was a Burkean. You'd never think it, but he really was that kind of a liberal. And I think that kind of politics consists in taking a pragmatic, in Burke's case rather dogmatic, but it doesn't have to be that way, rather pragmatic approach actually to what, let me crudely put it, we black box and what we don't, right? And so Keynes's entire project was to say to the emerging capitalist democracies of the 1920s, because that's what they were emerging. Like Britain hadn't had capitalism and democracy before the 20th century, anywhere, not even in Britain itself. If you're going to enfranchise the working class and have the Labour Party as a second party of power, you have a new type of governance issue. And Keynes's offer is basically to say, look, if we get rid of all of the dogmatic theory of the 19th century, I can offer you an economics toolkit which will make the problem of arbitrating capitalist democracy with actual class politics much more easy. Let's call this dentistry, but let us get to work and solve the problems we can solve in your mouths. We can't solve all of your problems, but we can solve these ones. And that, I think, is the same approach I would, if I was in an advocacy position, I would say that we need to take to Techno-solutionism as well. I mean, who can deny that this object has transformed all our lives? I have no idea how it works. I understand in outline how vastly complex it is to manufacture. It is, I think, the most complex mass-manufactured article our species has ever manufactured. And it solves a huge number of problems I have and enables me to do things I couldn't conceive of doing before, of an absolutely fundamental type. And so do I believe in Techno-solutionism? More than that. I'm a huge fan. I couldn't do without it. Of course, right? Furthermore, we know we're useless at all sorts of other things, like social distancing. We comprehensively, in most countries in the world, utterly failed at that kind of project. So instead, we all relied, well, certainly in the West, we ultimately relied on the vaccines to save us. That's not a bad plan. That's actually a really sensible plan, given our strengths and weaknesses. That's a Keynesian plan. Right? There's a fix, let's go for it. The thing that that screams to high heaven in the current moment, I do not exaggerate, screams to high heaven is our lack of seriousness about our commitment to the techno fix. This is the staggering thing, which points you back to really deep issues of political economy. What do I mean by that? If you go to the IEA, the most authoritative and quite conservative body that accounts for global energy investment and so on, they compile figures for global public investment in energy research. Now, if we are serious about the techno fix for the climate problem, you would think that would be a big number. It is 25 million, give or take, globally, investment, most of it still going into nuclear. The spend this year by American households on food and treats for pet dogs and cats is $35 billion. 10 billion more than the total amount spent by public bodies around the world on energy research. Are we serious about the techno fix? I would submit to you we're not even trying. We're not breaking a sweat. We're not even showing the inclination to take this seriously. I think we should, I'm a kind of, really a Marxian in this sense, or with all respect. Like, my critique of capitalism, apart from anything else, is it consistently fails to exploit the human potential that we have, right? It doesn't actually enable the full deployment of the genius of population after population. Look at all these numbers we've been looking at stunting, of underdevelopment, of the failure of primary education in India. That's hundreds of millions of potentially brilliant people who could be contributing to the solution of this problem who are not, because they can't access the basics, right? So the whole techno debate is framed within the parameters of a situation which itself is so fundamentally constraining, contradictory, limiting, right? That it's very difficult to arbitrate its claims one way or the other, right? But we should certainly, to my mind, hold the door. And what we cannot, however, do, and it's so transparent, like we cannot clearly allow ourselves to be taken in by what is in the end just a rather little story about tech. The story that Silicon Valley peddles is, in light of the potential that we could see, in the end quite a limited story. It's not as dramatic as they make out. It should be even more glamorous.
But so picking up on that and kind of bringing Marx and Keynes together. This sentence, which you rarely made the kind of mantra of our times. Anything we can do or willing and able to do, we can afford. Actually, do we can afford, right? Outside of revolution, war, and imperialism, on a kind of really significantly socially transformative scale, what other example would you think of as best embodying, in a sense, the political message of that kind of a slogan? Because there is that older story, right, which is that moments of crisis, particularly war, revolution, these are the three: war, revolution, and empire, in some ways, are the only moments where we see that kind of willingness and ability, right? Even taxation systems, formation of the modern state, war makes states, states make war, right? We were talking about state capacity this morning. So one is to just, if you can think of historically what you might have in mind as a kind of example that could serve as an instructive template outside of this war revolution story. And it's related to the Marxian question, which is that every time there is a technological revolution, right, there is supposed to be a collapse of the social and political forms that had contained the previous form of technology, right? The printing revolution, the rise of the nation state, the doing away of empires, little republics. Are we stuck with this combination of capitalism and the nation state, given the scale of this crisis? Are these two political forms even in principle capable of actually solving the technological possibilities that are with us?
And it's an urgent question, isn't it, for modern Indian history, because you aren't going to have a revolution. That was, that's one. Yeah. And you're not going to be, in the way that, say, a European nation state or the Soviet Union or even China was, the protagonist in a total war. Yeah. That doesn't mean that India hasn't fought wars and that they haven't exacted in, say, the Bengal famine, terrible price, but the British Empire was never really capable of mobilizing the Raj for a total war effort. That's a sign of the weakness of its imperial form, right? And so this is really rather an urgent question for India, because like you could say, like if we don't have either the driver of revolution or total war, what are the mechanisms of change? And you could arrive at quite, I mean, there's obviously a famous school of Indian social and critical thought arrived at very pessimistic conclusions about the implications of that. No revolution, no, name your list, like no true emancipation of women, no fundamentally rapid social and economic change, no overcoming of the enormous inequalities of this society. I'm not in the mood to go there, so I've been like trying to think constructively out from the Indian experience, and can we just maybe we can just de-dramatize and back away from those two giant challenges. What is at stake here? The promise of revolution is that of radical transformation and improvement, and the urgency of war is that it poses the question of life and death, and it demands your willingness to kill, which is a huge demand to make, and on the other hand, the willingness to sacrifice yourself. And I think you could say that both of those forms of politics are profoundly problematic for obvious reasons. One is very prone to huge errors, and the other one is a politics of enmity, and it's a Schmittian politics that doesn't really admit of dialogue, of communication. It's fundamentally undemocratic in quite fundamental ways. So maybe first of all, if we're actually serious about politics, we should try and frame it outside those. So then where would you go? And don't you go to something like, exactly the terrain that somebody like Hannah Arendt was profoundly allergic to, which is, shouldn't we insist that the real business of modern politics, and this is horrifying for an Arendtian, is in fact maybe the social, right? It maybe is in fact the incremental work on the welfare state, the progressive development of the potential of human life and the realization of human capacity through those structures that we were talking about this morning, which are increasingly global. I mean, this is one of the great untold stories of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, is allow me the simple diffusionism, but the diffusion out from the advanced economy world of various forms of welfare state and social safety net to practically every country on the planet. And that seems to me to be a dramatic story that is hugely undersold. And it's one way of thinking about the triumph of 2020, is that it is terrible. 18 million people died. It's a shambles. But on the other hand, there was a global, uncoordinated, but nevertheless, this dramatic effort on practically everywhere to prioritize human life and its survival, and then various types of, adjustment to make economic life. So I would, and I think if we could think forward, in terms of the great drama of, climate change and resilience and adaptation, it seems to me, and for this reason, I'm skeptical of, and have written skeptically about, the infatuation of the climate left in the West with Bolshevism. I mean, it's extraordinary. I mean, people like Andreas Malm, who was an utterly brilliant, seductively brilliant man, but takes us back to basically saying, look, can we pose this question in terms of, and not just war, the Russian Civil War. I mean, one of the most barbarously total visions of war that Europe has ever seen in its bloody history. That, for him, becomes the anchor of a conception of climate change. I'm not ready to surrender. I don't think that's a helpful place from which to surrender. We just say surrender to that kind of pessimism about our situation.
I'm completely sympathetic to your argument. I mean, most of us are kind of ameliorative liberals in some respect, but there is something about this moment, right, which is extremely impatient and fed up of this politics. It's almost like an aesthetic revulsion, both on the left and on the right, that whatever else we might want, the one thing we don't want is a status quo just amelioratively progressing towards this. How do you, in a sense, analyze, and how does one kind of respond to that almost aesthetic, visceral distaste for exactly this kind of politics? Keynesian reasonableness.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's, I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure I can, here we are, two of us. Come on, look at the audience. There's loads of nice people who've come out to hear us talking. I don't think we're actually, crying in the wilderness. It's my sense.
They won't.
Well, if one did ask people how one votes, right, surely then the next question is to say, well, you and I talked about this, right? Say you're seeing a phenomenon like in India, where you're seeing the supersession and an overthrowing of a secular project of the mid-20th century, which in retrospect could seem like a kind of hubristic vision. It's a little bit like first-generation Zionism. They were going to build a Jewish state, except it wasn't going to be Jewish. And you were going to have an Indian nation, except it wasn't going to be Hindu. And that's not the place that we're currently in, and that's not the future, and it doesn't make sense to talk reasonably about the future in which one doesn't recognize that force. So then let's back out and say, okay, so within those more integralist projects, what form, and you could read those as apocalyptic, and if you're a diplomat, as we heard from Menon yesterday, it's an apocalyptic world in which democratic parliamentary politics intrudes into the space of diplomacy. Fair enough, I get it, like it is indeed disturbing. On the other hand, we also had, these heroes of the toilets program. And where does the toilets program come from? This is the classic ameliorism that us, medialist liberals are committed to. I think the question we have to ask ourselves is it not, as it were, the failed expectations, the failed delivery, the failure to make good on the promise of development for so long in the 50s, 60s, and 70s? The real promise of it would open the door, on the one hand, to the vision that you're seeing in India now, and on the other hand, an even more dramatic form, of course, to the Chinese model. So I think we can navigate this terrain and concede to people who are up here, as enemies in a sense, the force of a certain sort of historical vindication, and recognise that it's a little bit like, say, the New Labour project in Britain in the 90s, right? Those people came back after the wilderness years in Britain of the 80s and early 90s with an incredible determination to deliver various types of progressive social policy. And it was not the old left politics. It was not democratic in a broad-based way. It did not have trade union backing. But did they improve the living conditions of children? Did they reduce child poverty? Did they expand the welfare state in important ways? They did. And I'm the very last person to be an apologist for Tony Blair, but nevertheless, there is real change and progress in that kind of politics.
What do you think made that politics so fragile? And I'm kind of going back to sort of some of your work in the 1930s, because, one of the interesting things about the amelioratist project of improvement, right, is it has, in a sense, been very easily appropriated by the right as well. It's become a kind of ideologically neutral project. Bismarck opted for kind of cash transfer, basic income. Churchill, there's a kind of long history to it in some ways. And so, what's your sense? So, one simple explanation, right, which is that some political parties just are very bad at doing this. So in India, if the Congress was just better at doing it somehow, that would kind of just get us through. You have to project the kinds of governance credibility. If the Democratic Party could solve the housing crisis in San Francisco and New York, maybe you'd have a different story. Is it really at that level of sort of, a kind of governance deficit, or is there something deeper going on in the way in which the right has managed to, in a sense, align both that ameliorative project, or at least appropriate it? There's a joke going around that, every criticism of liberalism, the right is actually taking it and running with it much more effectively than the left is. So if you were to kind of just reflect on that phenomenon, how do you see it? Is it just the nuts and bolts of democracy, get the party system right, and you'll have another Tony Blair or, UPA 1 or something?
I think it's such a big question, and I think there are three different dimensions to this. One is definitely the ideological imagination, and there is what somebody was referring to it earlier on, dashboards. When ameliorative liberalism becomes a series of dashboards, it's losing the argument. And the right, right now anyway, my very clever graduate students say that it has a much more vivid dialectical imagination. They're able to turn things on their head and spin things around and dynamize them into dramatic stories in the way that the centre left is failing to do. Right. So I think that there's the centre is failing to do. So that's undoubtedly part of this. And it has something to do with us being too buttoned up and too worried about, propriety and the chain of logic and evidence. And this is why I'm also quite suspicious about, it was very typical that the New York Times makes such an easy target, but like the obsession of the New York Times reading public about, the delinquencies of the Republicans with plagiarism and fact-free politics, and they hadn't done their homework, and their essays didn't have footnotes, and they were all stealing things from other people and unapologetic about it. They're so naughty, and they should clearly be relegated from the class. And it's like, grow up. We're not in the classroom. This is like, or in the children's room, as Hannah Arendt would say. We're playing for keeps, right? And when you're playing for keeps, you do play, right? You actually do play. We're not doing homework, right? We are actually trying to craft narratives. Bill Clinton might be the last, of the Democratic politicians. Barack Obama, of course, sold a story, but in his heart, he was the ultimately good student, right? No one has never been a better student. But there are two other dimensions to this, which are no less important. One is, in the center of, as well, of course, we have a coalition of social interest problem. And what is the coalition of interest, which mean that the Democrats can't, quote unquote, solve the housing problem in San Francisco and New York? Everyone knows how to solve it. It's just that you've got entrenched local upper middle class interests who are defending their property rights by way of the political system. And that's what's going on. And you only have to look at the results of the Italian election, where the left center party is overwhelmingly a party of upper middle class folks like us. Everyone here is, part of that, right? And the fact that we have evacuated the space of more popular politics, and then you can get into super contentious arguments about wokeism and so on. We don't need to go there. But that is part of the problem. And the third element is and this is more deeply entrenched, is the intolerance of the center for conflict, open social contestation, the movement element, the clashing, the striking, the willingness to blockade, to engage in that kind of politics. And my willingness to talk to somebody like Andreas Malm is that the most obvious thing for somebody like me to do when you encounter somebody who writes a book, people may not know, but he wrote a book called How Do You Blow Up a Pipeline, right? The obvious thing for folks like us to do with somebody like that is to lock him up.
Yeah.
And he's tempting us. He wants us to lock him up because that is classic, extreme left position. We'll expose the underlying fault lines, and then we can actually organize the kind of clashes that are necessary, because the non-violence, and again, the non-violence of progressive politics, all the way back to Gandhi, and he's very, very rude about Gandhi, is the problem. And now, I find that in itself entirely unpersuasive, but unless you are willing to be open to a conversation, at least, with people like that, negotiate before you shoot them, because you may in the end have to, right? This is the lesson of all centrist politics, and we should not flinch from it, right? But if you're not willing to engage in the first initial conversation, you've lost the game straight away, right? Because that social force, that mobilization is an irresistible force of social change in its own right. And if your liberal, law-abiding, law-first conception of power from the very beginning rules out any engagement with those kind of forces, you're done. You've handed, this is the lesson of the Weimar Republic in 1919, you've handed so much of the game to the other side. You've removed people who ought to be your allies and coalition partners, and crucially, vital backstops against the violence of the other side. You've removed them from the equation, right? And so that's, I think, those three elements, the dialectical imagination, our own internal coalition problems, and the allergy against the different, the truly militant type of politics is really crucial.
Yes, although except after Nord Stream, who blew up the pipeline has become a whodunit. Not just a but just staying maybe one more minute with this question, and then we'll sort of, maybe switch gears a little bit. Since you, referred to the 1930s and in a sense, Weimar and it's kind of, one doesn't want to draw kind of too many analogies, but the fragmentation of the center and left, the unwillingness in some senses to fight or make, in a sense, liberalism a kind of fighting creed. But in your analysis of Weimar, when one thinks of kind of apocalyptic outcomes of this movement of the right that we have, particularly in India, right? This question that none of us have a very kind of, in a sense, clear handle on, which is, at least in Hitler's rise, it's very clear that Hitler's anti-Semitism is not a deal breaker for a large number of people who are supporting. That's the most, it's not a deal breaker. That's the mildest thing one can say about, in a sense, a number of the supporters. It's also very clear, of course, that there is a deep economic crisis in the background. There is a deep national humiliation that prepares the groundwork, at least for the possibility of a politics of this kind. But both methodologically as a historian and just thinking about it in political terms, how does one disentangle these different motives as they operate in the context of a struggling Weimar Republic? Hitler had his agenda very, very, very clear. He never hid it. There's no duplicity about, in a sense, where he's heading, both in the final solution, but what he actually means by political authority. These three words he uses in Mein Kampf, which is popularity, coercion, and tradition. This is the trinity of power. It has a lot of resonances elsewhere. So does the possibility of is there something about the nation-state form that actually makes the possibility of breaking with the right on something like genocidal violence that much more difficult? That as much as we might try and instrumentalize, say it's a governance problem, say it's a problem of the imagination, say it's a problem of political mobilization and tactics, there is a kind of powerful autonomous force that this kind of prejudice where you can target a community for being who they are operates, and that actually has an autonomous dimension that has to be understood in its own terms. Or do you think it is kind of largely functional in some ways?
It was fascinating. I should say that when I came to India, I did not expect to be asked so regularly and such profound questions about Nazi Germany. I'll just leave that in the room for you. Right from the very beginning, first question I was asked at CPR, and now this one. And I can see exactly where your point is heading. I think it's undeniable that that nation states have within them, well, let's put it this way, they have to struggle really hard and be constructed a rather peculiar way. And then continuously, as I was saying yesterday, like ride the bike, you actually have to continuously manage if you are going to avoid the kind of logic that you're pointing to. Because the simplest way of resolving who is the sovereign in the nation state, especially the democratic nation state, is us. In other words, people who look like us, are marked in some visible way like us, pray to the same God, speak the same language, something that does this work. And if that's not the case, you've got much more complicated, more interesting, of course, emancipatory, more open-ended possibilities, but they're much more complicated. So yes, this is definitely there. It's worth saying, right, that just so you know where you're at, that Hitler's National Socialist movement was never majoritarian, not even close. Like it's in the free and fair election, it scored 37% of the vote. Just saying, just so you know, 37% of the vote. Even with the repression of the election they had after they'd taken power, and they were already setting up the concentration camps, still couldn't get to a majority, right? So, just so you know, Germany is not India. Like Germany is the product of the 30 Years' War and the Reformation, and it's split three ways. And only once in Germany's long history, going back to the 1860s, of nationwide elections has one party achieved 51% of the vote. Only once. It's ever, all previous periods been coalitional, and the governments have rarely had a margin of more than 55, 56% in parliament, right? So it's an inherently pluralistic society. The other crucial point to make is, though I would, and that's not reassuring from your point of view. This is the point, and the other point I would make and so the other thing, three things worth saying. The Jewish minority in Germany was at most 1.5% of the population. So in Germany, right? So could you easily imagine a party that took power amongst those functional circumstances, that had the radical politics of Hitler's party, where people were willing to turn a blind eye, embarking on Nuremberg law-style persecutions of that 1%, 1.5% majority? That's a train carriage of 100 people. One person in this train carriage is going to be persecuted. Easily, obviously, that could happen practically anywhere, on practically any grounds. It happens routinely on all sorts of grounds right now, here and now, right? And so, is that likely? Yes. A lot. Eugenics, too. Deeply built into the biopolitics of the modern nation state from the early 20th century. All sorts of population politics, natalism, all of those things. And Germans voted for those. But it's important to distinguish, and this goes back to a point about Putin yesterday, like it's important to distinguish between a regime which is full of these sorts of forces and has a deeply resentful view of the world and sits there slowly cooking and venting its frustrations on local minorities, which is how you could describe Germany in the 1930s, and what Germany unleashed on Poland in 1939. Because at that point, it isn't Germany that's acting, it's the SS that's acting. And what they are launching into is not your cookie-cutter standard eugenicist, ethno-national vision. What they're embarked on is a project of deliberately unleashing what the Germans knew was going to be, or certainly was likely to become, what they called a Weltkrieg, a world war, which meant a war against the British Empire because the British Empire was a world formation. And behind the Great Britain and its empire stood the United States, as it had done in World War I. And they knew they were doing that. So that is an apocalyptic leap into national ethnic risk. And the flip side of that, very, very directly, is the unleashing not of persecution, marginalization, apartheid, but of outright genocidal destruction through firing squad of the Jewish and Polish elite from 1939 onwards, both simultaneously. And of course, they overlap to a degree, but they only to a degree in Poland because of Poland's anti-Semitism. But the systematic shooting to death of tens of thousands of people under the cover of the war and directly associated with it. And that doesn't follow. I don't think you can say that nation states in general have that apocalyptic, all-out, do-or-die. That's a very peculiar politics, and Germans as a whole did not sign up for this. This element of Hitler's anti-Semitism was actually quite arcane. It was held quite close. If you read and took seriously Mein Kampf, you could infer it, but no one truly believed it. And they have to have a series of sort of come-to-Jesus retreat-type moments with the German leadership where they say, yeah, we're entirely serious about what we're doing. Yeah, we're going to do this. And as soon as it becomes evident, the conservative elites in Germany begin to push back up to and including the armed resistance that then fails in 1944. But the German military leadership splinters over this question. And but for the happenstance, and again, Ukraine is haunting, but for the happenstance of what happens on the battlefield in France in 1940, which opens the floodgates to this, for Germany to then invade the Soviet Union, it could very well have just been a bubble that exploded under the weight of its own absurdity and irrationality, because this project doesn't make any sense and Germany will lose again. It's only really a question of time until it does. And so we should not retrospectively, like Hitler's like a guy with a terrible gambling habit who's clearly destined to self-destruction, who goes into a casino and for 4 nights running just breaks the bank, night after night after night after night. And out of that comes this disaster, which now stands for us as this extreme of racial violence. But you can't infer back from that to ordinary people who just buy a lottery ticket, right? Who are in the business of wasting money on the lottery, but are not in the business of taking their entire... I mean, they do worse. Like he rents money from a loan shark, a mafia loan shark, Stalin, and takes that to the casino and gambles that and wins. This is you cannot, so it's very important. And so I'll leave that with you, like size up your problem. Do you think that's your problem? If you think that's your problem, you're in real trouble.
Yeah, I mean, it's always wonderful to kind of think about whether the knowledge of kind of the contingency of these formations is actually reassuring or disturbing. But so
I told that story, by the way, to a bunch of cadets at West Point and said, if you see at home your younger brother mortgaging the house, borrowing money from the local mafia and going to Vegas, and they ring you up and say, oh, it went brilliantly. I won $1 million. It's fantastic. What is your duty? If you're a soldier, when you see that happening, what is your duty? And it was like totally bamboozling. They don't, you should go home and deprive your younger brother of control. But on the other hand, you also know that's a violation of your military oath, right, to respect the civilian command chain. Hitler is the civilian command chain.
So, one of the themes in your work, I mean, the last, both in the work on the 1930s Germany, but in a lot of your contemporary writing, has been in a sense, so apart from nation-state capitalism, the other kind of big political formation that has sort of shaped the 20th century is sort of the Anglo-American empire, as it were, or at least the Anglo-American hegemony. And it's the dialectic of that Anglo-American hegemony that explains a lot of what happened in the 30s, and one of the kind of original arguments you made in your work was just how crucial that is in actually thinking about what happens in Europe in the 1930s. When you think in the sense of the Russia crisis and the Ukraine war, I mean, how much of the shadow of that Anglo-American hegemony not only still operates, but its political potency? I mean, in a sense, is this the sort of the last little hurrah of that? And are we looking at a transition to a world order where we can finally, in a sense, not marginalize? I mean, obviously, given your views on the dollarization, all that, it will be still significant, but some senses contain the long shadow of that Anglo-American hegemony that has driven world politics for maybe the last, couple of 100 years.
Well, we can certainly take the Anglo out, can't we?
Right.
That's a relief. So we can strike that. Sorry, I couldn't resist that.
Yeah, no. One nation divided by a language.
Well, no. I mean, I meant self-erasure. Like, well, let me think about it. I mean, we should take seriously, I think, Putin's Munich Security Conference speech in 2007. I mean, I'm not into the Tim Snyder kind of, forensics on the inner mind of Putin, but when he speaks as clearly as he did, and, Putin at his best is an extraordinarily lucid analyst. He also speaks incredible German, I discovered recently from a speech he gave to the Bundestag in the early 2000s. So, this sort of degenerate Putin we're facing now is perhaps not who he was in 2007. But I think we should take seriously what he said there, which was, that the encroachment of the American empire had gone too far. He clearly regards the 1990s as an epic disaster. To that extent, he is, whatever the diplomatic relations, he's clearly a brother of Xi Jinping, who also regards 1989 as, this catastrophic break in world history that needs to be overcome. And I think, it's fair to say that Putin's regime, is, as it were, pursuing a project in its own, by this point, like truly deranged way of trying to challenge and break that. The essential point to realize, though, is that this is not the Soviet Union, right? So the point is that the Soviet Union's immense, remarkable military-industrial power was autochthonous. It was grown, it was autarkic. It was grown from inside the resources of the Soviet Union and its immediate allies. Whereas Putin is this extraordinary product of the insertion of Russia and its fossil fuel resources into America's unipolar moment. Crucially, including China, right? So Russia's, as it were, capacity to mount this project, to engage in this, well, we can afford it, so let's just go do it kind of challenge, is enabled by the incorporation of China in its growth regime into this American superintended structure. And if the question is America still able to hold the ring on that? I mean, the answer is clearly no, absolutely not in any comprehensive way, neither politically nor in terms of global trade structures. Is it able to, on key axes of infrastructural power, as Michael Mann or somebody like that might say, maintain people's dependence on America by virtue of America's functional response to crises within the system? Absolutely, it is able to. You might ask how far that is truly strategic anymore. I mean, when the Fed does these things, why is it doing them? Is it a sort of Schmittian sovereign act of we declare the exception and now show our power? Or is it more, oh shit, the thing is blowing up, the house is burning down, we must act? In other words, it's financial dominance, it's the financial system piling down. But in any case, America can build, I think build is the right word, extend the grip of the dollar. So let me stage three levels. At the overall hegemonic level, America's grip is broken. At the level of infrastructure power, specifically within the domain of finance, its power is preeminent still in the vast majority of the world. In tech, they're currently waging a struggle over how they can draw the line. And America has some of the cards, but not all of the cards. And the most terrifying thing, and this is this sort of like, we all need to just wake up. They are actually conducting a battlefield test of their ability to dominate Russia, literally in the hours in which we're speaking. Right now, it's early morning in Ukraine, and the Ukrainians are completing that encirclement I was telling you about last night, and are now driving into what's left of the Russian positions in of that region of Ukraine that they occupied, whilst Ukraine is conducting these Russia's conducting these crazy referenda. And the Ukrainians can do that because of the equipment the Americans are supplying them with. But, is that hegemony or something far, far more fragile, right? I mean, that doesn't look like hegemony to me. That looks like some sort of open struggle. Now, it's very unequal, but this isn't asymmetric warfare, right? This is not Iraq, and the risks of nuclear escalation surely now are really going up all the time. I absolutely take, I think we really do have to take that seriously. Every day this goes on, the risk, that risk. And I don't imagine a transatlantic nuclear exchange, but something devastating in the region. How can we rule that out?
No, absolutely. No, and I actually agree with you. I think the logic is certainly moving in that direction. So we have just a couple of few minutes left, and since this is the Center for Policy Research, and as you noticed, we didn't talk about policy at all, which we generally don't at CPR. But
let's talk about research.
So that's exactly. I want to ask kind of a couple of questions about sort of the politics of knowledge at this particular juncture, and particularly I think for a lot of the young people in the audience, young researchers at CPR. So there was a Governor General of Hong Kong who once famously refused or said that the Hong Kong government would not collect official statistics. And he prefaced it by saying that the problem with collecting statistics is that if you collect statistics, you have to do something with them, right? Now, your first book was in a sense an absolutely brilliant exploration of the frames in which we actually understand the modern economy. The modern economy has to be presented to us as an object of knowledge. It is presented to us as an object of knowledge through statistics, through a whole range of sort of, in some senses, techniques. And as you showed even in your first work, I didn't realize even something as basic as an argument over trade imbalance in the Weimar Republic was actually subject to a deep politics of interpretation. Now, one of the strands I've noticed in your kind of a lot of the recent writing is you talk a lot about the politics of knowledge. And I don't mean in the crude political sense, is Paul Krugman a Democrat, or, are they covering for Biden? But you're very good at articulating the sense that there is actually something going on in this moment about how we represent the economy to ourselves. When it comes to, let's say, a debate around inflation. And it's not just about getting it wrong or right, but something much more fundamental about the representation of the economy as an object of knowledge. Can you just kind of speak about the politics of that this moment and how it's actually, in a sense, playing out in a lot of these kind of confused debates we are having about, in India, it's actually a live debate. In some senses, what is the accurate statistical, what does it mean to actually represent an economy like this? The selection bias and how you categorize, what you choose to measure. So any thoughts on that, the politics of, economic knowledge at this point?
Oh yeah, no. I think it's one of the great thrills of being here is that you see live, especially a brilliant think tank like CPR and some of the other institutions I visited, at JNU in a seminar there, I had the same impression that that India it's fascinating. The Indian elite is fascinating because you're preoccupied with this classic question of like, how do you know the country? And if you don't know, what question are you even asking? Like, if you don't know what you're asking about, how do you even ask the right question? And what's fascinating about that, it's tempting to read that in particular the Indian terms, in terms of, I don't know, the legacies of imperial rule and the fact that so many folks grow up with English as their predominant language rather than Hindi in this kind of collective. So there's a sort of inherent separation between the elite and the population, which must just sort of haunt you in every moment. I know that as a rootless cosmopolitan myself, but also just the one can read it, I think, in however much more general terms, which is that in India, as a country, well, we were talking about it yesterday, like in transition, perhaps blocked transition, frustrated transition, you live with categorical confusion in a sense, right? You live in a society which requires multiple different, not just categories, but systems of categories to describe it. And so if you are going to adequately describe the Indian labor market, you're having simultaneously to capture very standardized labor markets, much like those pioneered in the West 100 years ago, and on the other hand, peasant agriculture, and not just peasant agriculture, pure and simple, but peasant agriculture in transition by way of urban spaces, which also defy categorization, whether at the enormous scale of Colossus Delhi or at the level of census towns, which aren't really towns, but, so, and that, to me, is fascinating because that is the work of modernity. I think that is, it's so amazing to see it up close and with this intensity because, and it's a message I'll take home because in a sense, I think in the West, we too often imagine that these problems are resolved and done with. And we do know where our society is, and all we need to do is pull out the standard OECD data set, and then we'll know what's going on. And that's an illusion, right? It's profoundly illusory, or rather, it's premised on a whole series of very complex constructions. It's a bit like saying, this will do the job. Well, it will if you've got power and you understand the microelectronics and you can plug it in and download the apps, right? But if and only that. And the categories that we have are like that. And that has been a continuous stream in my work. I mean, for me, the one break moment was the 2008 financial crisis, which is a crisis which is not legible in terms of the standard macroeconomic toolkit because it's happening within the banking system. And we couldn't see it. And then once you did see it, it was obvious what set of categories you needed. What's going on in London last week is easily misunderstood. It's not actually a currency crisis. It's a bond market crisis producing a macroeconomic dysfunction in that market, which requires a completely different analysis from one that's focused on Britain's balance of payments, its twin deficit. That just takes you in the wrong direction, as we've seen, because the pound has recovered. And you cannot then properly interpret political action either. What the Bank of England is doing is not monetizing the huge fiscal deficits the Tory government ran up. That's absolutely the antithesis. It's bailing out BlackRock, amongst others, actors who are up to their necks in these collateralized derivative trades with huge pension funds. Totally different politics. One would be a politics I'd endorse. Monetized Keynesianism, I'm there for it. The other one is essentially an inside business bailout. Right? So being able to read these categories properly also enables you, in a sense, to understand this logic. And for me, the challenge of genuinely critical analysis, and this is, an argument inside the left, is not endlessly to find ways of adapting, modifying, revivifying, and then applying to the present categories of 1970s, left Keynesian, neo-Marxist analysis. Not because I don't hold those people in great respect, and as a historian, I understand why those concepts arrived at those moments, but staying incredibly close to the moving frontier of our struggle to solve the Indian problem every single day, everywhere in the world. In other words, what the hell is going on and who are these people and how do I fit in relation to them, right? And you referred, very flatteringly earlier on to a group of people that do indeed inspire me, and this is one respect in which the young Marx, and Marx inspires me. Because if you think about his project, it wasn't to take heterodox theory and make it explain the 19th century. It was to take the most orthodox theory and the data produced by the deepest insiders in the machine of power that he could find, which would be factory inspectors, and with their information expose what he called the mystery of the factory and get into the heart of the labor process, where he thought the great riddle was held. Now, I'm not committed to any of that analytic, but that method strikes me as incredibly inspiring. The being in. And this is what I see CPR doing habitually, right? In this process of sifting the categories, working with journalists, business people, government officials to try and shape that deep understanding of the categories and how they do and don't fit and what they might enable us to do.
So now you know why your Excel sheets have world historical significance. So one last kind of question to close off, and it's a question you have asked a lot of economists in your latest chart book, when this kind of crisis in the UK broke out sort of a couple of days ago. And you asked this kind of interesting sort of higher level question that, when somebody like, Larry Summers, Paul Krugman, anybody who's writing in the public sphere with a degree of sort of academic authority writes, what kind of a speech act is it? What do they think they're doing? Now, as academics, our first instinct to say, look, it's our job to say simple things like, if the deficit runs out of hand, inflation might follow or something, and that's all we are doing. I mean, what else is there to say about this kind of act of writing? So one kind of invitation to you kind of elaborate about, what do you think is involved in public writing of that sort? I mean, at least we used to operate with a fairly untheorized assumption that this is a kind of contribution to public reason. And if you were to ask that question of yourself, you're easily the most prolific and wonderful public intellectual of our times. What kind of a speech act is the act of writing? It's obviously at one level it's an analytical description. At one level it is illuminating. But clearly you think there should be something else there. And how do you see your own writing in that context?
Well, the easy bit is like the kind of explanatory, hey folks, here's an interesting report, like I am going to feed off CPR things on Indian agriculture for months to come. Because the world needs to know this stuff is just too important and too interesting and people don't know. Sorry, like 200 million people. Anyway, it's insanely interesting. So that's the simple part. Like putting that stuff out in like a kind of classic way, the kind of Fabian impulse in some sense. I think it gets trickier, and I generally spare myself from writing about Brexit because I'm so traumatized by the shock, given my upbringing. I lost the legal framework that makes sense of my identity at the moment of Brexit, and it's kind of unforgivable, and anyone who's been through that process knows what pressure it unleashes in you. And so I don't generally write about it. But if I do write about it, one answer to your question is simply write in militant mode. In other words, you discipline yourself to cool your anger to the point at which you can usefully inform your own side about the weaknesses of your opponents so that you can defeat and crush them and write them out of history and consign them to the dustbin of history, which we have wrongly removed from our own repertoire. This is where we get militant, and this is where these people need to be, humiliated and crushed. And we should be clear about moments like that because it's a bad emotional position. This is bad karma. Your blood runs hot. I think quite clearly. It's just a personal attribute. Some people don't, but like adrenaline of that type, like clears my mind. A lot of people love those angry pieces I wrote this week. I intend to spend several weeks not writing anything angry like that again because it makes me a bad guy to be around. But then I think there are two other types, and I realized I came to clarity about this because I wrote a savage piece like that about the Tories for The Guardian, which was saying, folks, this is just the beginning of a rolling campaign. The only way to make sense of what these bastards have done is that they're going to cut spending next. You should be braced for this. Take them seriously. This is the plan. So that's just intelligence. You get close enough and disciplined you to read these people so that you can analyze. Then I was, next morning gleefully reading all of the media about, everyone in the entire world trashing the Tories. And you're just tempted to recycle this and pump this out because it seems to be fodder for your own argument. And then you sit back and you think, exactly what is the standpoint of these other people? What are they doing? Like, some people appear to be engaging with the British government in the interests of persuading them to stop doing the crazy things that they're doing. And I have a theory that they're not accidentally crazy. They've not made a mistake. They know what they're doing. So when you sit down with people like this and tell them they should change their ways, you're misunderstanding the situation you're in and who you're talking to, right? Because you should really be bringing a gun. You should not be talking to them, right? You should be in the business of actually taking the fight to them in which they, and this is the crucial thing, in which they unhesitatingly will take the fight to us, right? We should be clear about this, right? So that's a misunderstanding. And furthermore, tactically, I don't get it. No, I want the Tory government to crash and burn, right? And the problem, of course, is I have dearest and friends who've got big mortgages, and they're going to be in serious trouble when this happens. But that, ladies and gentlemen, is politics and how this works and why it's for real, right? And they should therefore go on the street and mobilize and try and accelerate the election that will sweep these people out of office. But we should not be in the business of saying, tinker with this, that's bad Keynesianism. Hydraulic stability should not be our goal. Remember the third thing, an aversion to conflict. We should not be averse to conflict in this struggle. We should embrace it in a sense. Now that's easy to say, and it does pose deep philosophy of history problems, because I am literally advocating harm to people I care about. Like, friends wrote to me saying, Adam, do you realize, my mortgage payment's going to go up by £1,000. This is a great school teacher, ex-student of mine. He doesn't know how he's going to cope. He gets it. He's on side.
but those are the trade-offs. That's why I think you have to take it very seriously. And that's then my third point, because there's a third type of commentary on a situation like this, which I don't think is actually morally and politically serious, or rather the game it's playing is very tangentially related to the material and the cases that provide grist for its mill. So when somebody like Larry Summers wades into an issue like this, he, I don't think principally, gives a damn one way or another whether the UK is ruled by the Tories or the Labour Party. But what he does care about is demonstrating in a kind of public physics lesson whether if you defy the laws of gravity, you crash and burn. And he really wants to see the laws of gravity operating, or at the very least, he wants to be the school teacher who effectively enforces the lesson that do not defy because otherwise. And because you learned my lesson and because you were afraid, you did my bidding, and so what is being enforced essentially, I'm personalizing it around Summers, but it's easy to make the point. In other words, there is a form of critique in cases like this which is indifferent to the individual case and is fundamentally about enforcing a hegemonic thought structure. And it's not actually one I'm terribly congenial to. If the Tories had spent this money on sensible things and had then mobilized the Bank of England to back them up, I would be all for it. This isn't actually, so you end up with false friends if you're willing to consort with people whose game is really about, in an almost ritualistic way, demonstrating that they're right. This is what I call the gatekeeping function of a sort of super elite American economic academia. The game they're playing is a very long game. It's very indifferent to the stuff that goes in, and telling them they don't know anything about India or they don't know anything about Italy, that's highly beside the point. They don't have to, right? The point is they understand the laws of how this operates, and they need to be seen to be speaking them, and ideally they never get tested, because the embarrassing thing for them is they did this with Project Fear in 2016, and nothing bad ever actually happened, right? And so this is a dangerous game that they're playing. I think their logic is basically that now Britain is going to deal with the crises that should have happened in 2016. In any case, these are the options, it seems to be. Overt partisanship, a kind of rather delusional practical engagement, which I think needs to understand its own terms and to be willing to risk actually the bitter cup of advocating the bad, tactically. And then thirdly, a sort of universal gatekeeper function. And all of them are in their own way legitimate and powerful and out there in the world, but I think the crucial thing is to be very clear in your own mind about which position you're occupying.
Thank you, Adam. That is an extraordinary note to end with. Prepare for the fight, beware of false friends, and what's the point of writing if no one wants to cut your head off for it? Thank you so much, Adam.